Elena, she saved us all.
A group of ground crew technicians stood around a hangar, laughing at a woman who hadn't said a single word to any of them in 3 weeks, mocking her behind her back loud enough that she almost certainly heard every word. 4 months later, a decorated air marshal stood in front of an entire base, looked directly at that same woman, and told a room full of senior officers that she was the greatest teacher he'd ever had in a 30-year career. If you love stories about the quiet ones who turn out to be carrying more weight than anyone around them ever bothered to notice, subscribe right now before we start, because what this woman actually did on that base is the kind of thing that gets people rethinking everything they thought they knew about who deserves respect. And I want you playing along with me. The moment you think you figured out why she never spoke, drop your guess in the comments. Almost nobody gets the real reason before I explain it. Let's go back to the beginning, to an airbase hosting a joint maintenance and readiness program. Names and identifying details altered throughout this retelling to protect the privacy of everyone involved. On the day a new technician arrived, who would spend the better part of a month being treated like she barely belonged there. Her name, for this story, was Airman First Class Priya Chandran, 32 years old, transferred into the base's ground maintenance crew under circumstances that, to the technicians already working there, looked almost administrative in nature. A quiet reassignment, no fanfare, no introduction beyond a brief mention at a Monday shift meeting. What set her apart immediately, in the eyes of the crew she joined, wasn't her technical work, which she performed competently and without complaint. It was her silence. Priya did not talk. Not in the break room, not during shift handoffs beyond the minimum required exchange of information, not in response to the casual banter and joking that fills hangar floors during long maintenance shifts. She observed. She worked. She said only what the job strictly required, and not a syllable more. In a culture built, like a lot of tight maintenance crews, around camaraderie expressed through joking, ribbing, and constant chatter, Priya's silence read to her new colleagues as strange at best, standoffish at worst. Within the first week, a small group of crew members had already started treating her presence as something to work around rather than someone to work with. And within 3 weeks, that treatment had curdled into open mockery, comments made just loud enough to be heard, jokes about her being the ghost, questions asked among themselves about whether she even spoke English, delivered with exactly the kind of casual cruelty that groups sometimes extend toward anyone who doesn't fit an established social rhythm. Here's a question I want you to sit with while we keep going, because I want your honest answer in the comments later. How often do you think people mistake silence for something negative, weakness, coldness, even incompetence, when really it might mean something else entirely? Because this story is going to answer that question in a way that, I think, most people watching won't see coming. What none of those technicians knew, because it genuinely wasn't the kind of thing that gets explained casually on a hangar floor, was that Priya's silence wasn't standoffishness, and it wasn't shyness in the way people usually mean that word. Priya had spent the 4 years prior to that assignment working in an extraordinarily specialized and demanding technical role as part of a small team responsible for advanced diagnostic and safety-critical inspection work on aircraft systems where errors carried consequences measured in human lives, a role that had trained her, deliberately and specifically, to minimize unnecessary talk during working hours, because in that particular discipline, distraction wasn't just unprofessional, it was dangerous. More than that, Priya had spent nearly 2 years of that specialized assignment embedded directly with the unit under the command of a rising air marshal, a decorated officer whose name, at that point in his career, wasn't yet widely known outside specific circles, but whose reputation within them was already considerable. During that assignment, Priya's specific expertise in a particular class of advanced diagnostic inspection had become, quietly and almost by necessity, one of the most relied upon technical resources within that unit, to the point where senior personnel, including the officer who would later become that same air marshal, routinely deferred to her judgment on safety-critical calls that, in a less specialized environment, would typically fall to someone with considerably more visible seniority. None of that traveled with her paperwork in any way that made it obvious to a new crew meeting her for the first time. Her transfer summary listed her prior assignment in broad, technically accurate, but almost entirely uninformative terms, the kind of bureaucratic shorthand that tells you nothing about what someone actually did or how good they actually were at doing it. To the crew she joined, she was simply the quiet new technician who didn't talk, and that, unfortunately, was enough for several of them to decide they already knew everything they needed to know about her. For 3 weeks, Priya absorbed the mockery without responding to it directly, continuing to do her work with the same quiet, methodical precision she'd apparently brought to every assignment throughout her career. She didn't report the comments. She didn't confront the crew members making them. She simply kept showing up, kept doing the job in front of her, and said nothing beyond what the work required. The same discipline that had defined her entire specialized career applied now to a situation that had nothing to do with aircraft safety and everything to do with basic human decency that a handful of her new colleagues simply weren't extending to her. That brings us to the events that changed everything. Roughly a month into her assignment, on the day an announcement came through that would completely upend how everyone on that base understood who Priya Chandran actually was. The base had been selected to host a significant readiness inspection and training visit, led personally by the same air marshal Priya had previously served under, now considerably more senior, considerably more widely known, and, as several officers on the base quickly discovered while preparing for the visit, notoriously demanding about the technical standards he expected to see during these inspections. The visit was treated, understandably, as a high-stakes event by base leadership, and preparation in the weeks leading up to it involved exactly the kind of intense, all-hands effort that puts everyone, including ground crew, under considerably more scrutiny than usual. Nobody on that maintenance crew, least of all the technicians who'd spent weeks mocking Priya's silence, had any idea that the officer flying in to lead this inspection had, less than 2 years earlier, worked directly alongside the woman they'd nicknamed the Ghost, relying on her technical judgment during a period of his own career that he would later describe, in front of an entire assembled base, as formative in ways he hadn't fully appreciated until well after the fact. The inspection day itself began, for most of the base, as a fairly standard, if unusually tense, readiness review. Officers walking the flight line, reviewing maintenance logs, observing crews at work. Priya, going about her normal duties, was working a routine diagnostic check on an aircraft system when the Air Marshal's inspection party, moving through the hangar as part of the broader review, happened to walk directly past her workstation. According to 4 separate witnesses who described the moment afterward, the Air Marshal stopped mid-stride, looked directly at Priya for a long moment, and then, in front of his entire inspection party and a rapidly gathering group of base personnel who'd noticed the commotion, said her name out loud with clear, immediate recognition. "Chandran, I didn't know you were assigned here." The hangar, by every account, went almost instantly completely silent. The specific kind of silence that happens when a room full of people simultaneously realizes they've badly misjudged something. Priya, for her part, responded with the same calm, minimal composure she'd shown throughout her 3 weeks on that crew, simply confirming her assignment and answering the Air Marshal's brief follow-up questions about her current role with the same economical precision she brought to everything. What happened next is the part of this story that personnel who were present that day still describe as one of the more remarkable things they've witnessed in a routine inspection visit. The Air Marshal, rather than simply moving on with his scheduled review, paused the formal proceedings for several minutes, and, in front of the assembled inspection party, base leadership, and a steadily growing crowd of curious personnel drawn by the unusual scene, explained, briefly but unmistakably, exactly who Priya Chandran was, and exactly what she had meant to his own development as an officer. He described, according to multiple accounts that closely matched each other afterward, a period roughly 2 years earlier, when he had been leading a technically complex, high-pressure assignment and had relied on Priya's diagnostic judgment on multiple occasions where the margin for error was, in his own words, essentially zero. He described a specific incident, details of which he kept deliberately general, given the sensitivity involved, where Priya's technical assessment had identified a critical issue that several more senior personnel, himself included at the time, had initially dismissed, and where her insistence on flagging it, despite considerable pushback in the moment, had ultimately prevented what he described as a potentially serious safety failure. He then said the line that several witnesses specifically remembered word for word because of how directly it landed, given what everyone in that hangar had just watched play out over the preceding weeks. He said, "I've had a lot of instructors in 30 years of service. Priya Chandran is the best teacher I've ever had, and she never once raised her voice to make her point. She just made sure she was right, every single time, and let the results speak for themselves." The crew members who had spent 3 weeks mocking her silence were, according to 2 witnesses who specifically noted their reactions, standing close enough to hear every word of it. Nobody needed to name them directly for the moment to land exactly where it needed to. The aftermath unfolded over the following days in a way that several personnel described as a genuine, if largely unspoken, recalibration across the entire maintenance crew. The technicians who'd been openly dismissive of Priya didn't make a show of apologizing. That kind of culture rarely produces dramatic public reconciliations. But the mockery stopped immediately and completely, replaced by a noticeably different tone in how the crew interacted with her, one that several newer personnel who joined in the following months would later describe as simply the way things are, without any awareness of the history behind it. Priya herself, by all accounts, didn't dwell on the moment or use it to assert any particular authority over her new colleagues. She continued doing her work with the exact same quiet, minimal-talk discipline she'd brought to the job since her first day, apparently entirely unconcerned with using the Air Marshal's public praise as leverage for anything beyond simply being treated with the basic respect she'd deserved from the beginning. Base leadership, in the weeks following the visit, took the opportunity to more formally recognize Priya's technical expertise, eventually shifting her into a role with expanded responsibility that made better use of her specialized diagnostic background, a correction that, while clearly overdue, at least ensured her actual capabilities were finally reflected in her assignment, rather than buried under an administrative summary that had told her new crew almost nothing true about who she actually was. What strikes me most about this story isn't really the moment the Air Marshal said her name in that hangar, dramatic as it undeniably was. It's the 3 weeks before it, 3 weeks of a genuinely exceptional technician being mocked for a discipline that had been trained into her, specifically because it made her better and safer at an extraordinarily demanding job, simply because her new colleagues had decided, without a shred of actual information, that silence meant something worth ridiculing rather than something worth understanding. She never explained herself. She never needed to. Her work had already explained her, to exactly the person whose opinion, it turned out, mattered most. So here's my question for you, and I genuinely want your honest answer in the comments below. Do you think Priya should have said something earlier, given her colleague some context, instead of letting the mockery continue for 3 full weeks? Or do you think the crew members should have known better than to mock someone's silence without ever bothering to ask why it was there in the first place? Tell me honestly where you land, and tell me, before the reveal, did you already suspect her silence was actually discipline rather than something to laugh at? If this story kept you hooked, hit subscribe before you go, because we tell stories exactly like this one every single week. The quiet ones, the underestimated ones, the ones whose silence turns out to be worth more than anyone around them ever gave it credit for. And if there's a story like this you want covered next, drop it in the comments below. I read every single one. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one.